So today we're going to be making our daily sourdough loaf of bread that we're going to be using for sandwiches. I made a bunch yesterday and the neighbor came over. We had about 7 inches of snow again on top of what we had the other day. We had 18 inches. So he came over and was nice enough to plow our driveway. So I gave him our last loaf of bread. So here we are today making more bread. This is going to be a quick loaf, so it's not going to take all day from morning till night to do its job, because we are going to use a little bit of active dry yeast. So right now I have half a cup of warm water inside of my KitchenAid mixing bowl, and then to that I'm going to add 1.5 teaspoons. I'm going to sprinkle it on top, 1.5 teaspoons of active dry yeast. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to let that sit for about 5 minutes. And I'm going to get all my other ingredients ready, and then I'm going to come right back to this, and it's going to be bubbly and good. This is the sourdough starter that I have. This is the sponge, actually, that I'm going to use today to make the bread. Last night I added flour and water to this, and I think later on, after I make this bread, my daughter Hagen and I, we're going to show you how to feed your sourdough starter and how to keep it alive and active and ready for all of your baking that you're going to be doing with your sourdough. The yeast is now starting to bubble up a little bit, so we're going to give it just a little bit more time to get really active, and then we're going to add our starter. The yeast and water has been sitting inside of our KitchenAid mixer for about 5 minutes now, and it's all foamy and frothy and ready to go. The next step is going to be to add to the yeast. We used 1.5 teaspoons of yeast to half a cup of warm water, and we let it sit there for 5 minutes. Next, we're going to add about 2 cups of our sourdough starter. It's super bubbly and gooey and ready to go. So I'm going to stick this into the blender. And I am notorious for not measuring. So let's see how this goes. It's about last night when I made the sponge, the sourdough sponge, to add to the bread. It was about 2 cups with some extra in there left over to keep my starter going. So we're going to add all of this goodness in here. There we go. One more hefty scoop should do it from our spatula. Very stringy stuff, huh? Then what we do is lift up our stand mixer and turn it on just enough to incorporate the warm water with the sourdough starter and the yeast, just to kind of give it a little bit of a mix up. Push all this sourdough back down into our jar, and then in a little while, my daughter, my little kitchen helper, she's going to help us make some sourdough starter, or to feed our starter. After a few moments of that, the next thing we want to do is measure in 2.5 cups of flour. Now what I've done here is I went ahead and measured out 5 cups of flour, and I used King Arthur's whole wheat flour, and I also used King Arthur's unbleached, non-enriched white bread flour. And I combined them together equal parts, and then what I'm going to do is I'm only going to use 2.5 cups of this blended mixture right here. So quickly, I'm just going to measure out 2.5 cups of this flour mixture. There's 1. 2. Then we're going to just switch over to a half. And I may or may not use all of this flour that I've set aside in this bowl. It just depends on the texture of the bread. And then to that, we're going to add 1.5 teaspoons of salt. So I'm using pink sea salt. Oops, there goes a little bit into my bread pan. So I'm going to actually use a little bit less. So it calls for 1.5 teaspoons of salt, so I'm going to do 1.25 teaspoons. So there's 1. And then here's 1/4. Just because it tends to be a little bit more salty and more dense than any other kind of table salt. And then we do the same thing with sugar. And we are making 1 loaf of bread. So right now I'm going to do the full 1.5 teaspoons of sugar. 1, 2, because who doesn't like a little bit of sugar? This is organic, unrefined sugar. So, put that back up there. I'm just going to give this a little spin with my measuring spoon. Likewise, you can also use a dry whisk just to mix it up. And then what I want to do is add cup by cup to my mixture in here in my KitchenAid. Wow, it's going good. Kind of keep dumping this in here. Let it do its thing. And I'm using a paddle whisk, so what I'm going to do right now is try to get some of this dough off the paddle whisk and switch over to my dough whisk. We now have the dough whisk attached, and I'm going to turn it back on. And let this work for a little while. Once we get everything incorporated, it's going to knead for about 5 to 7 minutes. You can see now the dough is starting to come together and form a bit of a ball, and it's not so sticky to the sides of the KitchenAid mixer anymore. Here we see how good the KitchenAid mixer is kneading the dough on very low speed. Okay, so our dough is ready to go into a greased bowl for its first rise. A greased bowl or an oiled bowl. I'm going to use some avocado oil, and I'm just going to do a quick swirl in this Pyrex bowl. I'm going to take off my KitchenAid dough hook that we used to knead the dough. And then inside here we have our dough for our 1 loaf of bread, sourdough bread. So I just kind of reach in there like that, pry it out with my fingers, and it all comes out like that. Whoops. And I like to make it into a nice little, neat little ball with my hands, like that. And then what you do is you throw it in the oil bowl and give it a few spins and tosses. Make sure it's really covered well. After that, I just took a piece of the flour sack towels that you can get from Walmart, and I got it wet in the middle part that's going to be over the bowl with warm water. I'm going to cover this bowl, and I'm going to set it in a warm place to rise for about 90 minutes until it doubles in size. Okay, this is the bread underneath the towel, and it looks like it is definitely doubled in size, or over doubled in size, so pretty soon it will be ready to throw in the loaf pan. And I just have my oven set on warm, and this sitting on top of the stove. Okay, so here we have our freshly risen bread, and what I'm going to do briefly, real quick, is just take some grease. This is vegetable shortening, and I'm just going to smear it on my work surface. I use flour usually on my work surfaces when I do traditional loaves of sourdough bread, but because I'm just doing a quick loaf of sourdough bread, I'm going to use this shortening, and that's going to keep the dough from sticking while I make it into the loaf shape that I need. So the next thing we do is we just dump this out onto the work surface, and then what I like to do is just kind of stretch it long ways like this, and then fold it into thirds, because it makes an amazing loaf. So then what I do is I fold it up this way once, and this way once, out into a loaf, and then I just kind of fold it in a little bit so that we have this general shape. This is going to be our loaf. This is the pan right here that I've greased up and I have ready to go. So what I'm gonna do is all my ends are pinched and turned under. And so I'm just gonna add this to this loaf pan. There we go. Give it a little shake. It's all ready to go. Once again, we're gonna cover it up with our cheesecloth and set it on the stove to rise for about another hour to an hour and a half. And then it's going to go straight into our oven. Just as the bread dough reaches the top of the pan, you want to set your oven to 350 degrees Fahrenheit. The oven is preheated to 350 degrees Fahrenheit, so in goes the bread loaf. Or the dough loaf. Alright. So we're going to set the timer for 35 minutes. And then that's when I check it. And usually 35 to 40 minutes is just about perfect amount of time. I didn't slash the top of the bread loaf because I find that slashing the tops of my bread loaves never really works. The loaf baked in the oven at 350 for about 35 minutes exactly. It looks like it's perfectly done. Now what I'm going to do is take it out and put it on a rack so it can cool. So we just remove it. I just flip it over onto the rack like so. Flip it up like that. Sometimes what I do is test to make sure it's hollow. And by doing that, I go. Sounds good to me. Looks like our bread is done. We're going to let it cool and then we'll have at it.